Back. I now recognize Mr. Griffith for a 3-minute statement.
Good morning. I want to again thank the leadership of this committee for including the Energy and Commerce Committee in this hearing. Dr. Fauci, the recent revelations that Dr. Morenz, a senior advisor, and your Chief of Staff, Greg Folkers, routinely evaded federal records laws, including the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, and those were a shock. That was a shock. I've been doing oversight now for over 14 years, or right at 14 years, and the scale of the effort to evade FOIA by some at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, or NIAID, has surprised even me. These men were among your most senior and trusted staff at an agency you led for nearly 40 years. They worked for you for decades. Your calendars show that you met with them multiple times a week during the pandemic. You co-authored dozens of papers with Dr. Morenz. He directly implicates you. Even the head of the NIAID FOIA office was apparently in on some of this conspiracy. And I know my colleagues on the other side love to say we're always talking conspiracy, but when the facts lead you there, whether you knew about it or not, when the facts lead you that your agency was involved in some form of a conspiracy related to COVID origins, we have to follow those facts. It is hard to believe that all of this occurred without your knowledge and or approval. In civil law, when one party has destroyed or refuses to produce evidence that's within its possession, a jury is allowed to draw an adverse inference that the information destroyed or not produced was unfavorable. Therefore, until we get a full accounting of all of the communications among NIAID's leadership, it's reasonable for us to assume that missing information would mirror the private doubts expressed by so many virologists and other scientists related to your public positions. While telling the public, the media, and Congress that COVID-19 almost certainly emerged from nature, experts you convened as a team privately worried that a research-related incident was a possible, if not the probable, origin of the virus. Dr. Christian Anderson even said in February of 2020, quote, "I think the main thing still in my mind is that the lab escape version of this is so friggin' likely to have happened because they were already doing this type of work and molecular data is fully consistent with that scenario." Further, while you and other NIAID officials were assuring us that the virus could not have come from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, NIAID didn't actually have an idea as to what the full scope of Wuhan's coronavirus research was, or even the trajectory of its gain-of-function research. Now, that may be because EcoHealth wasn't giving you the reports. I grant that. But this joint investigation has shown just how little oversight NIAID does of risky experiments involving potential pandemic pathogens. NIAID set up a system designed to greenlight potentially risky experiments while avoiding HHS department-level review. The same program officers who act as advocates for their scientific area are responsible for assessing whether an experiment is too dangerous. That creates a conflict of interest. I think that means that when an agency is taking the final approval, we ought to take that final approval away from the agencies like NIAID that fund it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Dr. Fauci, February 1, 2020, you were on a call with Dr. Farrar, Dr. Collins, and other scientists regarding the potential that COVID-19 was engineered. Was CDC Director Redfield on that call?
No, he was not.
Okay. Dr. Fauci, you've said that you had to rely on virologists and evolutionary biologists regarding origins because you're not an expert. Is Dr. Redfield a virologist?
I believe he is. Yeah.
He is. Prior to the pandemic, NIAID awarded at least 3 grants via the New York Blood Center to Dr. Zhao Yusen. Are you aware of these?
I'm sorry, to Dr.
Yusen Zhao. Are you aware of those grants?
Person?
Dr. Yusen Zhao. Your microphone is not on, Doctor. Your microphone is not on.
I'm not familiar with that name.
Okay. Well, NIAID awarded at least 3 grants via the New York Blood Center to that that scientist. He was a high-ranking Chinese PLA official and director of a lab at the Chinese Academy of Military Medical Sciences. Does it concern you if U.S. taxpayer dollars are funding someone like this?
Grants that are submitted to the NIAID go through a very
Does
extensive...
it concern you? I'm not talking about the process
Well,
right now.
I don't know
Does it
anything
concern you that that U.S. taxpayer dollars would be going to someone who's a high-ranking Chinese PLA official? Yes or no?
I would have to know more about that, Mr. Chairman,
Okay.
because I don't even
Well,
know
it
the
concerns
person
me.
you're talking about.
Are you or were you ever aware that the U.S. State Department in 2005 issued warnings that the Chinese government was working on the creation of bioweapons?
I was not aware of that.
Thank you. Did you ever discuss the Chinese bioweapons program with anyone in the intelligence community?
I've never discussed the Chinese bioweapons program, to my knowledge, with anybody.
Before, during, or after the COVID-19 pandemic, did you speak to the FBI, CIA, DIA, or any U.S. intelligence agency concerning viral research of any kind?
What time frame are you talking about, sir?
I said before, during, or after the COVID-19 pandemic. Did you speak to the FBI, CIA, DIA, or any U.S. intelligence agency concerning viral research of any kind?
I can't give you the specifics of it, but back in the time of the anthrax attacks, we certainly had a number of briefings of by agencies that were intelligence agencies. I don't remember who they were. It could have been any of the above that you mentioned, about the possibility that there were bioweapons that had fallen into the hands of bad actors, i.e. terrorists, that might have been used potentially as a bioterror attack. That was at a time when we had thought that the anthrax attacks...
I appreciate that. I appreciate your expertise in that.
Well, that's the answer.
But did you at any time talk concerning viral research of any kind?
Again, I say that at the time that there was concern about the fact that Al-Qaeda may have been using or potentially using bioweapons, we had discussions with intelligence agencies about that possibility.
But not as related to, say, COVID-19.
Not to my knowledge about COVID. Now, but let me just make sure we get the facts. After the investigations began about COVID, I was briefed by intelligence agencies about possibilities of there being activities going on in different laboratories. I was briefed by intelligence agencies.
Thank you. Science is always open to debate, and it's a benefit. The science supported restricting travel from certain countries at the beginning of the pandemic. And after these orders went into effect, the president was called racist and xenophobic. Dr. Fauci, you said in your transcribed interview that you supported those orders. Dr. Fauci, were those orders racist and xenophobic?
No, they were not.
Thank you. The vaccine saved millions of lives, and I want to thank you for your support and engagement on that. However, despite statements to the contrary, it did not stop transmission of the virus. Did the COVID vaccine stop transmission of the virus?
That is a complicated issue because in the beginning, the first iteration of the vaccines did have an effect, not 100%, not a high effect. They did prevent infection and subsequently, obviously, transmission. However, it's important to point out something that we did not know early on that became evident as the months went by, is that the durability of protection against infection and hence transmission was relatively limited, whereas the duration of protection against severe disease, hospitalization, and deaths was more prolonged. We did not know that in the beginning. In the beginning, it was felt that, in fact, it did prevent infection and thus transmission, but that was proven as time went by to not be a durable effect.
Yeah, definitely had a positive effect for many people, especially those that were vulnerable. But we knew from the trials that people that got vaccinated still were subject to getting COVID. So was the COVID vaccine 100% effective?
I don't believe any vaccine is 100% effective.
Now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Comer from Kentucky, for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you. Dr. Fauci, in your opening statement, you attempt to distance yourself from your previous senior advisor, Dr. Moran's. You say that Dr. Moran's title was just made up, that he was not an advisor to you, and that his office was in a different building. So, Dr. Fauci, did Dr. Moran's report directly to you?
Actually, I'm not sure exactly what the on-paper report is. He is senior advisor to the director, but it is conceivable we can get that information. He might have reported through someone lower, like my deputy.
So your senior advisor did not report directly to you?
There are very few people who report directly to me.
Okay, Dr. Moran's testified that he could walk into your office anytime he wanted to. Is that true?
No, that's not true. You don't just walk into the office. I mean, he's there. I mean, it's conceivable that he could.
Did he ever walk into your office?
I would say he did occasionally, but the idea, can I finish the answer to you, sir?
No, because I've got a lot of questions.
Okay.
Dr. Fauci, did you ever delete an official record?
No.
Dr. Fauci, did you ever conduct official business via email?
To the best of my recollection and knowledge, I have never conducted official business via my private email.
So there's a troubling pattern of behavior from your inner circle, not just Dr. Moran's, but also your chief of staff, Mr. Folkers. Do you agree that it violates NAID policy to use personal email for official purposes?
The Dr. Moran's issue that was discussed by this committee violates NIH policy, yes.
But does using official email, using a personal email for official business, does that violate policy?
Using a personal email for official business violates NIH policy.
Does it violate NIAID policy to delete records to intentionally avoid FOIA?
Yes.
Okay. On April 28, 2020, Dr. Moran's edited an EcoHealth press release regarding the grant termination. Does that violate policy?
That was inappropriate for him to be doing that for a grantee as a conflict of interest, among other things.
So on March 29, 2021, Dr. Moran's edited a letter that Dr. Dasick was sending to NIH. Does that violate policy?
Yes, it does.
On October 25, 2021, Dr. Moran's provided Dr. Dasick with advice regarding how to mislead NIH on EcoHealth's late progress report. Does that violate policy?
That was wrong and inappropriate and violated policy.
On December 7, 2021, Dr. Moran's wrote to the chair of EcoHealth's board of directors to, quote, put in a word, end quote, for Dr. Dasick. Does that violate policy?
Should not have done that. That was wrong.
And that violates policy?
Well, I'm not sure of a specific policy, but I imagine it does violate policy. He should not have been doing that.
In addition to all those actions, Dr. Moran's wrote to Dr. Dasick, quote, Peter, from Tony's numerous recent comments to me, they're trying to protect you, end quote. Did you ever talk to Dr. Moran's about Dr. Dasick or EcoHealth Alliance?
I can tell you, regarding what you said, I never spoke about protecting him. I mean, obviously, we knew that Dasick was a grantee, so I may have mentioned and discussed Dr. Dasick because he's a grantee, but I never spoke about protecting
You're testifying
him.
that he just made that up.
Excuse me?
You're testifying that Dr. Moran's just made that up.
I don't know where he got that, but that's not true.
So by this point, Dr. Fauci, when these emails were written, you should have known that Dr. Dasick was more than 2 years late on a required progress report with his grant. Dr. Dasick conducted an experiment that resulted in a novel virus showing excess growth, that Dr. Dasick failed to report that experiment, that Dr. Dasick was protecting the Wuhan lab and not sharing its lab notebooks, and that Dr. Dasick failed to disclose obvious conflicts of interest. So why were you trying to protect Dr. Dasick and EcoHealth Alliance?
I repeat on the record, I have not tried to protect Dr. Dasick. And that's number one. Number two, you said something that's not true, because I did not know about the compliance issues until well after the fact, when I was being briefed for going to before a congressional committee. So it wasn't as these things were going on, I knew that he was withholding.
Did you know about Dr. Moran's close relationship with Dr. Dasick?
Dr. Moran's made it clear that Dr. Dasick was his friend. I did not engage in any of that interaction between them.
And just lastly, if I may, Mr. Chair, you testified and answered the chairman's question that you never had any communication with the intelligence community throughout all of COVID. Did I understand that correctly?
No, you heard wrong. I said I did have communication. I was briefed by the intelligence community multiple times during the COVID issue.
And you never...
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Raskin. Now recognize Mr. Griffith from Virginia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's good to see you, Dr. Fauci. So take a deep breath, because my questions change sometimes based on things that happen in the hearing. And I want you to follow the bouncing ball with me. And there's no gotcha at the end of this. I'm just trying to figure this out. You told Dr. Ruiz in his questioning that it was absolutely impossible for any of the viruses that you all were funding, I get that, it was impossible for SARS-CoV-2 or SARS-CoV-2, known as COVID-19, to have come from any of the work that was being done at Wuhan. At the same time, you told Mr. Comer that you didn't know about the noncompliance by EcoHealth until after the fact and when the virus is already out there, however it got there. In light of the fact that part of that noncompliance was a report where we uncovered, and I believe that Dr. Dashak was untruthful to this committee in one of his reports to NIAID, and further, that in the two most sensitive years related to the humanized mice experiments, we never got lab notebooks from Wuhan Institute of Virology. Can you understand, following the bouncing ball, why some of us doubt that, not that you had some hand in it or that you knew about it, but that doubt that you can state with certainty that it was impossible because they might have been doing stuff you didn't know about? Isn't that true?
Actually, it's not incompatible at all, Congressman, with what I said. The viruses that were studied, whether you did or did not give a 5-year report on time, were still the viruses that phylogenetically would be impossible to be the precursor of SARS-CoV-2. So it was completely compatible with the statement that I made to Dr. Ruiz.
Is that accurate as well, knowing that they had worked on adding a furin cleavage site to MERS?
But, sir, there's a difference between the viruses that were funded by the NIH subaward versus anything else anybody else in China might be doing.
Excellent.
We were talking about, did the NIH...
You were talking about what you funded.
What we funded, and
all right.
That's the point.
And that goes to my next question, because I thought you might go there, and I appreciate that.
Right.
Because in an off-the-record member-level briefing in February of 2022, I asked about the likelihood and nature of a SARS-related coronavirus to have a furin cleavage site, particularly since it takes the 12 nucleotide change in there to make it as viral as this was going on. And at the time, you said to me pretty much what you just said, and I want you to just confirm it for the record. Well, that wasn't us. If that was being done, it wasn't us. Yeah. And you confirmed that for the record, yes?
No,
it wasn't you. It wasn't what you were funding.
What I'm saying is that I cannot account, nor can anyone account, for other things that might be going on in China, which is the reason why I have always said, and will say now, I keep an open mind as to what the origin is. But the one thing I know for sure is that the viruses that were funded by the NIH phylogenetically could not be the precursor of SARS-CoV-2.
And I appreciate that, because I've never thought that NIH or NIAID went out to create this thing, but I am a believer that it came out of the lab. and I think you've just made it clear, and sometimes people miss this, Dr. Fauci. One side says one thing, one side says the other, and the actual fact may be that at some time working on that, maybe they used some of our money to get started, maybe they didn't. But a group of scientists getting together might very well at Wuhan have said, hey, let's see what happens if we go over here and do this. Not that NIH funded it, but they on their own went off and did something. Isn't that accurate? Isn't that possible?
Well, I actually would want to say that one thing we should put out on the table, that you were talking about a $120,000 a year grant in a $6 billion budget. So, I mean, if they were going to do something on the side, they have plenty of other money to do it. They wouldn't necessarily have to use a $120,000 NIH grant to do it.
And I appreciate that because it means something could happen. I'm glad you kept an open mind. I would ask this one final thing, though. Do you think they could have done it without the humanized mice that we gave them?
Yeah, could have done what, sir?
Could they have done any other research with the humanized mice that we gave them? Would they be successful? China didn't have the humanized mice before we gave them to Wuhan. Isn't it accurate that they might have been able to do extra stuff with our mice?
Sorry, sir. That's a hypothetical that I can't really answer what they could have.
But you can't say it couldn't have happened either. I yield back.
You want me to prove a negative?
Now recognize Ms. Malliotakis from New York for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think many of us in the committee are really disturbed by revelations to this committee that there were officials at NIH that deleted government records, they deleted personal, or they used personal information, personal emails to communicate and circumvent freedom of information laws. So I just had a couple questions about that. Dr. Fauci, did you delete any emails or records related to the Wuhan lab or the origins of the virus?
No, I did not.
Okay. Dr. Morins said in a May 2021 email, he indicated that he was connecting people to you in a, quote, secret back channel. Do you know what he was referring to?
I don't have any idea what he's talking about. There is no back channel at NIAID.
Okay, there is, he also said in another email that there is no worry about Freedom of Information Act. I can send stuff to Tony on his private email. Did you communicate with anyone relating to anything regarding NIH or with Dr. Morins on a private email?
I do not do government business on my private email.
Okay, so have you communicated with Dr. Morins via private email, even if it was not necessarily your definition of government business?
It might have been because, as I mentioned in my opening statement, one of his functions is to write chapters, medical scientific chapters with me, so it is conceivable that I communicated with him on my private email when we were writing a chapter, and that was not official business.
What about Peter Daszak?
No.
Okay. I just want to clarify for the record, because today you testified that you did not suppress the lab leak theory, yet in the past you have said, quote, it is a distortion of reality, unquote. You've said, quote, I've heard these conspiracy theories, and like all conspiracy theories, they're just conspiracy theories. That's what you told the American people. And so would you like to clarify what science were you following then versus now?
Yeah, no, I've also been very, very clear and said multiple times that I don't think the concept of there being a lab leak is inherently a conspiracy theory. What is conspiracy is the kind of distortions of that particular subject, like it was a lab leak and I was parachuted into the CIA like Jason Bourne and told the CIA that they should really not be talking about a lab leak.
Thank you.
That's the conspiracy.
Appreciate that. Dr. Fauci, how much have you earned from royalties from pharmaceutical companies since the pandemic began in 2021?
Zero.
It says NIH scientists made $710 million in royalties from drug makers. You're saying that you did not receive any of the $710 million.
On COVID, I received, I think, $122 for a monoclonal antibody that I made 27 years ago.
Okay, so just in general, though, how much have you received, not related to COVID, just in general, how much have you received in royalties between 2021 and 2023?
I think none.
Okay, so somebody received the $710 million.
Somebody did, but not me.
You didn't receive any royalties? Okay.
I mean, I see no royalties associated with COVID. I mentioned.
yeah, I said-
No, I want to.
No, I just said
I'm
that-
on the record, and I want to make sure that this is clear. That I've developed a monoclonal antibody about 25 years ago that's used as a diagnostic that has nothing to do with COVID, and I receive an average of about $120 a year from that
Okay,
patent.
but the bottom line here is that scientists at NIH did receive $710 million in royalties, and I guess my question is, don't you think that if these experiments are made using American tax dollars, that any of those royalties, this nearly billions of dollars, should be going back to the American taxpayer, not in the pockets of the scientists? Do you believe that's a law that we should consider changing?
If you want to change the patent laws and the Bayh-Dole Act, then go ahead.
Okay.
But that's not for me to
Well,
say.
I'm asking your opinion. Okay, well, anyway, moving on, I just want to say that, we know billions of dollars have been funding these animal experiments, both here domestically and in foreign land. I'm very troubled by the cruel, horrific animal research that has been done on U.S. land and in foreign laboratories. Taxpayers are footing the bill for billions of dollars. These beagle puppies that have their throats slit, they are being injected with ticks, they are murdered after just a few months, piglets, rabbits, you name it. FDA is saying we no longer need to be testing human medications on animals, that there's other ways to achieve this. Can you comment on that, if it's time for the United States of America to be moving on from these cruel animal and horrific costly tests?
I'd be happy to comment, but I'm puzzled as to what that has to do with the origins of COVID.
Well, I have a question about it,
Okay,
and you're
I'd be
before
happy
this
to
committee,
answer
and
it.
it has to do in general with
Yeah.
the amount of waste of tax dollars
Right.
that NIH is using.
Well, the animal experiments that are conducted by and funded by NIH go through strict regulations of the proper use of animals in research. So I'm not, Congressman, with all due respect, I'm not trying to be confrontative. I'm not sure what you're talking about, but the experiments that the NIH funded go through strict regulatory processes of the treatment of animals, the humane treatment of animals.
Well, they're not very humane, and I will say, as the former director, you signed off on these experiments, and so my time has expired, and we will.
Well, I signed off on them because they were approved by a peer review.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr.
And now recognize Ms. Lesko from Arizona for 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Fauci, did the National Institute of Health fund the potentially dangerous enhanced potential pandemic pathogens gain of function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
I would not characterize it the way you did. The National Institutes of Health, through a subaward to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, funded research on the surveillance of and the possibility of emerging infections. I would not characterize it as dangerous gain-of-function research. I've already testified to that effect a couple of times.
So you're saying no, correct? In his May 16,
I'm saying no because they've said no multiple times,
Thank
including
you.
on the transcribed interview.
In his May 16, 2024 testimony, the NIH Deputy Director Tabak said, and I quote, "I can tell you that the failure of the Wuhan Institute of Virology to provide us with the data that we requested and the lab notebooks that we requested certainly impeded our ability to understand what was really going on with the experiments that we have been discussing this morning. My question to you, Dr. Fauci, if the NIH didn't inspect the Wuhan Institute of Virology and NIH didn't receive the lab books and data from China and the required reports from EcoHealth Alliance were not submitted, in fact, they were late, how can you definitively say that the NIH did not fund the dangerous gain-of-function research?"
I go back to what I said, that the gain-of-function research by the operative and regulatory definition of P3CO does not include at all the viruses that were studied under the subaward.
How do you know that, sir, if there was no lab books,
because
nothing from China?
We know what viruses they were studying.
How? How do you know? You never went there.
I'm telling you that the NIH funded research on these viruses. If someone else somewhere in China was doing something else,
Well,
That
and
was
that's the
not-
problem,
that-
because NIH didn't go there. You didn't get the reports that were needed. How in the world would you know? I'm going to go on to the next
Well,
question.
and you're not hearing what I'm saying.
Dr. Morenz, your senior advisor for over 20 years, said in an email dated February 24th, 2021, I learned from your FOIA lady here now how to make emails disappeared when I am FOIA'd, but before the search starts, so I think we are all safe. Plus, I deleted most of these earlier emails after sending them to Gmail. In another email dated 4/21/21, Dr. Morenz said, I forgot to say, there is no worry about FOIAs. I can either send stuff to Tony, meaning you, on his private email or hand it to him at work or at his house. He is too smart to let colleagues send him stuff that could cause trouble. Dr. Fauci, were you ever engaged in attempts to obstruct the Freedom of Information Act and the release of public documents?
No.
Did Dr. Morenz communicate with you about official business using his private email?
Official business? No.
Did you ever encourage Dr. Morenz to use his private email address for official business?
No.
My next question, sir, is on February 1st, 2020, yourself, Dr. Fauci, the NIH Director Collins, and at least 11 other scientists were on a conference call to discuss the origins of COVID. A number of the scientists said that they were concerned that COVID was the result of a lab leak at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and were concerned that a revelation of the lab leak theory would hurt their relationship with China. The CDC Director Redfield testified that he was not invited on this conference call, and he believes because he believed the lab leak theory was possible. 3 days later, on February 4th, 2020, 4 participants on the conference call the paper Proximal Origin, which was sent to you for editing. Proximal Origin pushed the natural origin theory. On April 16, 2020, the NIH director, Dr. Collins, emailed you expressing dismay that the Nature Medicine article, which was based on proximal origin, didn't suppress the lab leak theory, and asked you for more public pressure to suppress the lab leak theory. The very next day, in response to Dr. Collins' request to suppress the lab leak theory, you cited the Nature Medicine article, which discounted the lab leak theory from the White House podium. My question to you, sir, did you cite this article at the White House because the NIH director asked you to suppress the lab leak theory?
I did not do that in response to anybody's suggestion to suppress anything. It was in response to a question that someone asked at the podium. And I did not edit any paper as shown in my official testimony. So you said about 4 or 5 things, Congressman, that were just not true.
Well, we have emails to prove it.
Well, you don't.
Thank you, and I yield back.
And I'll recognize Mr. Cloud from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here. And I do want to echo some of what Mr. Nfume said, because I do think we need to focus on the people. And I think that's really what the angst that's left with the American people. It's what they had to walk through during this time. I'm going to go down a list of mitigation measures that you supported over the course of the pandemic and ask you just to give a yes or no as to whether you still believe these measures were justified. Business closures.
Not hearing you at all. Could you please speak louder?
Sure. I'm going to go through a list of COVID mitigation measures that you supported over the course of the pandemic and ask you to give me a yes or no as to whether you believe these measures were justified. Business closures?
Early on, when 5,000 people were dying a day, yes.
Church closures?
Same thing.
School closures?
Again, the
Stay-at-home orders?
These were important when we were trying to stop the tsunami of deaths that were occurring early on. How long you kept them going is debatable.
Mask mandates for adults, mask mandates for children, mask mandates for children under 5.
And going back to what I said before, all of that is in the context of, at the time, 4,000 to 5,000
mask mandates for children under 5, there's scientific evidence for that?
Excuse me?
Mask mandates for children under 5, there's scientific evidence supporting that?
there was no study that did masks on kids before. You couldn't do the study. You had to respond to an epidemic that was killing 4,000 to 5,000 Americans per
Vaccine
day.
mandates for employees, vaccine mandates for students, vaccine mandates for military.
Vaccines save lives. It is very, very clear that vaccines have saved hundreds of thousands of Americans and millions
I'm not
of
debating. We're talking
people
about the
worldwide.
COVID-19. Did or do the vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccine, stop anyone from getting COVID?
I answered that question to the chairman. Early on, it became clear that
They did.
no, actually, no. In the beginning,
not.
it clearly prevented infection in a certain percentage of people, but the durability of its ability to prevent infection was not long. It was measured in months.
And they didn't stop you from spreading it either.
Early on, it did if it prevented infection, but what became clear that it did not prevent transmission when the ability to prevent infection waned.
I think what's troubling is when the American people look at the certainty and the case at which people lost jobs, they lost livelihoods. I had rural hospitals in my area that did not have a single case of COVID in their rural community that had to shut down and people not get care that they did need for cancer, and some passed away because of those kind of things. Time after time again, people's lives are destroyed, and we have not seen the same sort of, once the new data came available, we did not see a change of course. And you'll point out, for example, in the schools that the CDC, put out the guidelines, for example. But we know that those guidelines end up being protection from lawsuits. It's, if you don't want to be sued, you better follow the guidelines. So they're not mandates, de facto mandates, but they turn out to be such a mandate. And when the science began to change, we all understand that in the first few weeks, even a couple months, we were all trying to figure it out. I think there's a lot of grace for that. The concern is that as the science became available, there wasn't like oh, maybe we should consider the lab leak theory. Oh, maybe we should consider natural immunity. We never heard this messaging coming from you or from anyone else who stood on the sidelines talking about these things. And it's left the American people with a tremendous distrust. I want to talk a little bit about the grant process. My understanding from your testimony to us, it says that the NIH process for awarding grants is that basically research proposal goes to peer review committee to receive a priority score. Then it goes to an advisory council for NIH personnel. It receives a final, basically the group votes on it, and then eventually it ends up on your desk for signature, right? Now, you said in that sometimes, if I recall correctly, those grants are often approved in block, in mass, when they're voted on, and then you sign off on them.
That's correct.
This is one of the things that's really troubling to the American people, because they look at their lives being destroyed and there's no one to hold accountable, because these systems of accountability have become systems of plausible deniability. And so your name is on every single grant, but yet you absolve yourself of any sort of responsibility by saying, well, it goes to this committee that's, that has a number of people on it, and they're approved in block, and so there's no accountability for anything, any of the taxpayer dollars that are going forth.
I disagree with you, Congressman, because if you look at the number of grants, we fund thousands of grants. It would be physically impossible for me to go through every single grant in a detailed way to understand it. That is true not only for me, but for virtually every institute at the NIH.
Then why does your signature go on it?
Because somebody has to sign off on it, and you trust the expertise and the competence of the staff that go over it very
Then what is the mechanism for
carefully.
holding
Gentleman's
people
time has
accountable?
expired. I now recognize Ms. Ross from North Carolina for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Dr. Fauci, for your voluntary testimony today, also for so much grace in your 14 hours of testimony. And I, again, want to thank you for your service and your patience. It's truly remarkable. Because it bears repeating, let me just remind everyone that after 15 months, my Republican colleagues' extreme allegations against you remain unsubstantiated. substantiated. And now, during your two-day closed-door interview in January, you discussed a number of topics regarding the public health response to the COVID-19 pandemic, some of which we've touched on briefly, but I just want to dive in a little bit deeper here. For example, you discussed both then and here with Congresswoman Castor the recommendation that we maintain 6 feet of distance between one another to reduce the spread of COVID-19. And you discussed how social distancing recommendations were developed, that you yourself didn't pick this 6 feet, and it was just really kind of a guideline in the moment. In your view, though, do social distancing recommendations and other public health measures to reduce transmission save lives?
Definitely.
Okay. I'd also like to go back and take a deeper dive into the COVID-19 vaccine discussion that we just had. And you were also asked about that during your interview in January. In the Select Subcommittee, we've heard suggestions that the vaccine was ineffective because of breakthrough infections that occur after vaccination. We just heard about that right here. But as I understand it, perhaps the strongest measure of COVID-19 vaccines' effectiveness is the reduction of severe disease and death, not necessarily getting a milder form of COVID. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, it's very clear that when you're dealing with many vaccines, but particularly when you're looking at COVID, as I mentioned, and I'll repeat it quickly for you, that early on there was a degree, not as much as against severe disease, of protection against infection. Unfortunately, that protection against infection, which is related to transmissibility, waned rather rapidly in a matter of months. What has stood firm, well, much better than transmission and much better than infection, is the ability to prevent someone from hospitalizations and deaths. And in fact, the curves, Congresswoman, are stunning. When you look at the deaths and hospitalizations of people who are unvaccinated, it's like this. When you look at the deaths and hospitalizations for people who are vaccinated and boosted, it's like this. The difference is profound. When you're dealing with infection, again, less so because of the waning of protection against infection.
Well, and that was also confirmed by a Commonwealth Fund December 2022 report that which came out 2 years after the Biden administration's effort to get COVID-19 vaccines in arms, and your effort too, that it prevented more than 3 million deaths and averted 18 million hospitalizations. And that came out in 2002, but it seems to corroborate what you're saying.
Indeed, and $1.15 trillion in healthcare costs.
Thank you for that add. One pillar of the vaccine requirements was to have an increased uptake in the COVID-19 vaccines. And that at the time was supported by leading physicians, including the American Medical Association, the American Academy of Family Physicians, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and more. Were the vaccine requirements a clinically sound tool for improving uptake of a safe and effective vaccine?
Yes, you would like people to get vaccinated voluntarily and realizing the important effect on it. But the fact that people were vaccinated by whatever their motivation was clearly saved many, many lives.
And just with the 17 seconds I have, what steps can public health officials take to bolster confidence in these life-saving interventions since there has been so much misinformation circulating?
That's going to be very difficult, Congresswoman, because there is so much mis and disinformation around that we've got to do a better job of reaching out and trying to get the correct information. But that's difficult when you have a very energetic group of people continually spreading mis and disinformation about vaccines. We've got to be more proactive in putting out the facts and the data and the information that's correct.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and I yield back.
Now recognize Dr. Joyce from Pennsylvania for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Wenstrup, for convening this important hearing, and thank you, Dr. Fauci, for testifying. Dr. Fauci, one of the controversial regulations of the pandemic was the 6-foot distancing rule. This rule became an important policy consideration in subsequent regulations. However, you testified recently, and I'm quoting, this 6-foot rule sort of just appeared. Do you think that a rule that sort of just appeared is substantial justification for the regulations that we saw based on that 6-foot rule?
Congressman, thank you for that question. I answered that, but I'll summarize it briefly for you. When saying it just appeared, it came from the CDC.
Okay, you stated that earlier. What was your relationship with the CDC when you saw a regulation which was not based in the current science?
Well, when I say was not based in science, I meant a prospective clinical trial to determine whether 6 foot was better than 3, was better than 10.
But once we realized that the virus was not spread by droplets and was aerosolized, did you feel an indication to go back to the CDC and said, let's base this on science. Let's get rid of this 6-foot rule. This 6-foot rule crippled businesses. It allowed students to stay at home and not learn. Americans suffered. And that suffering continues because the fracture of trust in American scientists continues to this day. Did you not feel an obligation for something that just sort of appeared, not to go back to the CDC and say, let's base this on what we know?
It was a CDC decision, and it was clear.
Were you dialoguing with the CDC?
Excuse me?
Were you in communication with the CDC?
CDC was part of the coronavirus response team. Yeah.
And you didn't feel an obligation to go to them and say, look, Americans aren't going to trust us.
Yeah.
We're providing them with misinformation.
We have discussions at the White House about that. We did, but the CDC's decision and was their decision to make, and they made it.
And you didn't feel an obligation as the lead scientist at the NIH to challenge that?
I've challenged the CDC multiple times.
Publicly on this regard?
Excuse me?
Publicly, you challenged them on the 6-foot distancing rule?
It is not appropriate to be publicly challenging a sister organization.
Do you agree that Americans now have lost their trust in science, in lead science from government because of misinformation like this?
Well, when you talk about misinformation, I think that you have to be careful. It's not disinformation. It was information that ultimately proved, when you put the aerosolization in, that
it was not an effective rule to have 6 feet of distancing. Dr. Fauci, let's move on. On April 21st, Dr. Morens wrote to Dr. Daszak in an email that there is no worry about FOIAs. I can either send stuff to Tony on his private Gmail, hand it to him at work, or at his house. He is too smart to let colleagues send him stuff that could cause trouble. Do you realize that this impact still considers today? This is your lead trusted researcher who works with you, your advisor. Do you realize the impact of that?
It was a terrible thing. It was wrong, and it was inappropriate.
Thank you.
I
think we all agree it was incredibly inappropriate. Recently, in an op-ed that Senator Roger Marshall published just yesterday, he raised concern about HHS FOIA compliance following your testimony in front of the Senate Help Committee. Dr. Fauci, what involvement did you have in HHS not responding to FOIA requests following your testimony in the Senate in 2021?
I had no role whatsoever in anything to do with the request. When FOIA is made, it doesn't go directly to a person like me. It goes to a department, which then takes care of it. So I don't have any role one way or the other in FOIA.
Let's go on. Were you aware that NIAID employees conducting official work on unofficial emails and inappropriately assisting grantees during your time as a director?
I was not aware of that as it was occurring. It obviously came out during the committee hearings, but I was not aware of that.
And I think that you put an exclamation point on how important these hearings are. Dr. Fauci, would you agree that this demonstrates the need for more accountability and increased oversight of NIAID?
What you saw, I believe, with Dr. Morens was an aberrancy and an outlier. The individuals at the NIH and NIAID are a very committed group of individuals, and this one instance that you point out is an aberrancy and an outlier. That does
From
not
your senior advisor for 20 years.
Well, the title is senior advisor. We wrote scientific papers together. He didn't advise me, as I mentioned.
Are your senior advisors not trusted staff?
Again, I told you that his title was senior advisor, but he is not an advisor on policy.
That's
writes
very confusing
science.
to have someone's title
Right.
and not having that to be their obligation
But
at
that
work.
is the fact, though.
I think that supports what we said. There needs to be more oversight and there needs to be more accountability. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, but these points are very clear to all of us today in this hearing room. I yield back.
Now recognize Dr. Jackson from Texas for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Fauci, I have to say, I, as so many Americans, am deeply disappointed in your actions during a critical time in our nation's history while you were in key leadership roles as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease and as the chief medical advisor to President Biden. Put quite simply, you failed miserably, in my opinion. Based on all we have learned during the pandemic and all that we have since learned through this committee's work, I believe your failures stem from both an effort of self-preservation, manifested by a series of lies and cover-up, and by a total failure of leadership. It was obvious to everyone that you and your organization, NIH, had a lot to lose if the American people were to discover that COVID-19 was most likely leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China, and that you, via EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak, actually funded this research, and that this lab was actively and recklessly conducting gain-of-function research. As such, you did everything in your power to deflect and cover up this possibility. You even recruited others to help you in this effort. Unfortunately, this cost our country and the world valuable time that may have led to answers regarding the origin, may have blunted the spread, and would have almost certainly saved lives. While I think most of us have known all along what I just described, what I have been appalled to discover through sworn testimony to this committee is the level at which you and those that worked for you went to cover up the obvious. Just a few examples, and I know these have been touched on, but they're important for everyone to hear. Dr. Lawrence Tabak, former acting director of NIH, testified that under the generic definition that NIH did in fact fund gain-of-function research. This was based on a definition that was initially used by NIH and a definition that was abandoned and removed from the website in October of 2021 and replaced by a new, much more detailed definition with a much higher bar that you have since conveniently used to define gain-of-function testing and to deny what Dr. Tabak has since confirmed. He also said that EcoHealth Alliance failed to properly and promptly report that their research violated the terms of the grant, something that went completely unaddressed under your watch. Dr. Morans, your senior advisor, who you have tried today to distance yourself from, but whose large volume of emails clearly demonstrate that you had a very close and personal relationship with, and who reported to you directly, has openly bragged about how he subverted FOIA requests. I remind you that the law requires you and your former organization to comply with Freedom of Information Act requests. It is not optional. If you or your employees or your organization that you oversaw were systemically avoiding transparency and illegally hiding or destroying documents that rightfully belong to the American people, then you should be criminally charged and they should as well. In addition, Dr. Gregory Folkers, your chief of staff, also engaged in illegal practices in which he crafted messages using symbols instead of letters to avoid FOIA exposure. In an email, April 2020, from Dr. Morans to Peter Daszak, he says, quote, "There are things I can't say." Well, I wonder what he couldn't say. He also went on to say, quote, "Except Tony is aware, and I have learned there are ongoing efforts within NIH to steer through this with minimal damage to you, Peter, and colleagues, and to NIH and NAID," end quote. And then a few days later, he said, quote, "I have reason to believe that there are already efforts going on to protect you," end quote. In February of 2021, Dr. Morans wrote to Boston University scientist Gerald Kirsch saying, quote, "I learned from our FOIA lady here how to make emails disappear after I'm FOIA'd, but before the search starts. So I think we are all safe," end quote. Dr. Fauci, I want to know what you were being protected from and what you needed to be safe from. I'm going to go on because I have a little time here. He went on to say, quote, "Plus, I deleted most of the earlier emails after sending to Gmail. Once again, illegal and an actual crime." Dr. Morans noted in another email to Dr. Kirsch saying, quote, "I learned the tricks of the I learned the tricks last year from an old friend, Marge Moore, who heads our FOIA office and also hates FOIAs, end quote. It is absolutely amazing to me that Dr. Morans and Marge Moore still have jobs and our taxpayers are still paying their salaries. Dr. Morans wrote to Dr. Daszak in April of 2021, quote, P.S. I forgot to say there is no worry about FOIAs. I can either send stuff to Tony on his private email or hand it to him to work or at his house. He is too smart to let colleagues send him stuff that could cause trouble. End quote. Apparently, you neglected to surround yourself with equally smart individuals. Dr. Morans wrote to another collaborator, Peter Hotitz, in June 2021 at Baylor College of Medicine that he had deleted all his emails related to COVID origin when, quote, the shit hit the fan, end quote. He said, quote, I feel pretty sure Tony were too. The best way to avoid FOIA hassles is to delete all emails when you learn the subject is pretty sensitive. In October 2021, Dr. Morans wrote to Peter Daszak, quote, Peter, from Tony's numerous recent comments to me and from what Francis has been vocal about over the past 5 years, we are trying to protect you. And they are protecting their own reputations as well, end quote. I'll just jump ahead. The American people can rest assured that we are going to continue to pursue answers and we continue to push for full accountability from you and your colleagues despite continuing efforts to try to cover this up. Dr. Fauci, history will not be kind to you and you will be known as the man who put his personal interests before the interest of the American people, the very people that you were supposed to be protecting. Your actions, along with several others we have had before this committee, have completely eroded America's trust in our public health system and the agency that you represented for half a century. With that, I yield back.
Gentlemen. Now recognize Dr. McCormick for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Wenstrup, Chairman. It's been insinuated that politicians, only bloggers, only conspiracy theorists are disagreeing with you. I want to point out that I'm probably the only member of Congress that actually treated patients during the pandemic from the very beginning to the very end of the pandemic, during night shifts in the ER. Thousands of patients during that time. And in 2020, I was censored. My medical license was threatened because I disagreed with bureaucrats. Literally taken off the internet as a person who was treating patients with leading-edge technologies, developing theories, but doing my very best, but being censored by the United States government for the first time, stepping in and taking the place of medical professionals as the experts in healthcare. Any dissent surrounding COVID-19 treatments, mask mandates, and any public policy surrounding the pandemic was immediately labeled as anti-science. I watched as public health officials and politicians told my patients what treatment options were best for them, regardless of their comorbidities or their medical history. Despite my education and my training and my experience, my opinions were relegated to conspiracy and misinformation by so-called healthcare experts who had never treated a patient throughout the entire pandemic. This has been a black eye on medicine and has highlighted why government should never insert itself in between patients and their healthcare providers. The American people deserve to make medical decisions through conversations with their physicians rather than politically motivated mandates. Dr. Fauci, did you ever treat a patient for COVID during the pandemic?
I was part of a team that was at the NIH that took care. We didn't take care of many of them.
Okay, so not hands-on. Got it. Thank you. Why would I be criticized by a bureaucrat for doing my very best as a healthcare? This is a rhetorical question. But why? Why would the government, who's never treated a patient for COVID, you can read all the things you want, but you're not there. You're not seeing patients. You're not watching people die, intubating patients right there with that disease in your face, watching it happen, watching the development of this disease and actually learning from it. But I'm being told by bureaucrats what's right and wrong. And what's funny is everything I was censored on, I was proven to be right. Pretty crazy, isn't it? You said in an interview that you gave as part of an audiobook written by Michael Spector that you believed an institutional should make it hard for people to live their lives so they'd feel pressured to get vaccinated. Could we run the audio clip on that, please?
You think can be done about it. I have to say that I don't see a big solution other than some sort of mandatory vaccination. I know federal officials don't like to use that term.
Once people feel empowered and protected legally, you are going to have schools, universities, and colleges are going to say, you want to come to this college, buddy? You're going to get vaccinated. Lady, you're going to get vaccinated.
Yeah.
Big corporations like Amazon and Facebook and all of those others are going to say, you want to work for us, you get vaccinated. And it's been proven that when you make it difficult for people in their lives, they lose their ideological bullshit and they get vaccinated.
Thank you. Are all objections to COVID vaccinations ideological bullshit, Dr. Fauci?
No, they're not, and
Thank
that's
you.
not what I was referring to.
Well, in reference to making it hard for people to get education, traveling, working, I'd say it very much was in context. And I take great offense to this. Miss Allison Williams testified before this committee about losing her job because she sought an exemption for ESPN's vaccine mandate, which came from recommendations from bureaucrats like yourself. She and her husband were actively working with a fertility expert, a physician, on how to get pregnant, and agreed with the premise that she was young, healthy, wanted to get pregnant, and shouldn't get the vaccination for medical purposes. But she was fired because you made it hard, just like you said in your statement, because you didn't want to make sure that the ideological bullshit got in the way of her working, of living her life, of making a medical decision with her healthcare professional. I think America should take great offense to this. That's exactly what you meant when you said making it hard for people to live without getting a vaccination. You affected people's ability to work, travel, be educated, to actually flourish in American society, to self-determine, as we're all given God-given rights. Shame on you. Dr. Fauci, you've become Dr. Fear. Americans do not hate science. I don't hate science. The American people hate having their freedoms taken from them. You inspired and created fear through mask mandates, school closures, vaccine mandates that have destroyed the American people's trust in our public health institutions. This fear you created will continue to have ripple effects over generations to come. You have already seen its effects in education, in the economy, and everything else. Quite frankly, you said, if you disagree with me, you disagree with science. Dr. Fauci, I disagree with you because I disagree with fear. And with that, I yield.
Gentleman's time's expired. Now recognize Mr. Jordan from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doctor, why was it so important that the virus not have started in a lab?
We don't know where it started, and that's the reason why I keep an open mind. So I don't know what you mean by why was it so important. It wasn't important.
You still don't know where it started? The guys you gave money to figured it out in 3 days.
No.
Mr. Anderson said on January 31st, 2020, virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory. The very next day, Dr. Gary said, I don't know how this happens in nature. It'd be easy to do in a lab. And then 3 days later, Shazam, they switch and say it has to be nature. So they figured it out in 3 days, but you still don't know?
No, in fact, if you look at what they were saying, Congressman Jordan, they were saying that it was not a manufactured virus. It still could have evolved out of a lab.
Well, let me read something here to you.
They're not incompatible.
In our study on the censorship of the Biden administration working with big tech, I want to read you a WhatsApp message from Mark Zuckerberg. Can we include that the White House put pressure on us to censor the lab leak theory? So this is a communication on July 16th, 2021. Nick Clegg, Joel Kaplan, Sheryl Sandberg, Mark Zuckerberg. They're certainly feeling the pressure to downplay any lab leak theory and go with the natural origin theory.
Is there a question there?
One's coming. Here's another email to Mark Zuckerberg. It says, subject line, COVID misinformation, Wuhan lab leak theory. In response to continued public pressure and tense conversations with the new administration, we started removing 5 COVID claims, including the lab leak theory. Mr. Zuckerberg responds, this seems like a good reminder that when we compromise our standards due to pressure from an administration in either direction, we often later regret it. Why was it so important the virus not have started in a lab?
Wasn't so important that the virus not. We don't know. We know.
Well, it was important to someone in the Biden administration, so much so that the top people at Meta, the top people at Facebook are asking, why are we getting all this pressure to downplay the lab leak theory? And we have an email from June of the same year, June 4th, 2021 saying the same thing. It was certainly important to somebody.
Well, what has that got to do with me?
I'm asking you because you're the expert on the coronavirus. I'm saying
Am
why
I
was
on
the
those
administration
emails?
why was the administration so pushing not to have the lab leak theory as something that was viable?
I can answer that. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire
You kept
process.
an open mind, Dr. Fauci, open mind.
That is correct.
What happened in those 3 days? Why did Dr. Anderson and Mr. Anderson and Dr. Gary, why did they change their mind in 180 degrees? Because what Christian Anderson says 3 days later, after he said virus looks engineered, virus not consistent with evolutionary theory, 3 days later he says the main crackpot theories going around at the moment relate to this virus being somehow engineered, and that is demonstrably false. How did they figure all that out in 3 days, Dr. Fauci?
You can do that.
Still have an open mind.
Well, what they did is that they testified before this committee. What they did, they went back and looked at the sequences and realized that their initial concern was unfounded about that, and it did not look at all like it was manufactured. But as they said in their paper, even though they feel it was more likely—
3 days, they figured it out.
That's exactly. You could do that
Okay.
in 3 days. You
Okay.
can scan sequences in a day. You don't need 3 days.
Okay, who's Robert Redfield?
The former director of the CDC.
Dr. Redfield, right? And he was also in the coronavirus task force. Is that accurate?
He was a member of the coronavirus task force.
And here's what he said to this committee. He said, Redfield said that Fauci and Collins left him out because Redfield suspected that coronavirus had leaked from the Chinese lab. Is that accurate?
Well, he said that, but that's not true.
You're
That
saying
is incorrect, Congressman.
Dr. Redfield's lying to the committee when he sat right where you sat?
When he said that I kept him out, that is an incorrect statement. The roster who was on the phone
was Dr. Redfield in that conference call on February 1st when you had Mr. Anderson and Dr. Gary on that call?
He was not. And the conference call was put together by Jeremy Farrar. So no one kept him out. He said he was kept out because he felt—
Did U.S. tax dollars—
You want me to answer the question?
Yeah, I would just wonder why he wasn't on the call. It seems to me the head of CDC, part of the coronavirus task force, which was formed 2 days prior to that call, would have been on the call.
Well, the call was arranged by Jeremy Farrar. You should ask him.
Okay. Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
I'm sorry, what was—
Did U.S. tax dollars flow through a grant recipient to the lab in China?
Yes, of course. It was a subaward to the Wuhan Institute.
And who approved that award?
Excuse me?
And who approved that award? What agency approved that award?
National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases.
Your agency approved that, right?
Yes, it did after—
Does that have anything to do with this downplaying of the lab leak theory?
No.
Nothing to do with it?
Nothing.
What, do you agree that there was a push to downplay the lab leak theory?
Not on my part.
Really?
Really?
Wow.
Wow.
I think most of the country would find that amazing. I still got 11 seconds.
Well, look at the facts. I've kept an open mind throughout the entire process.
All right, I yield back.
I now recognize Mr. Garcia from California for 5 minutes. Oh, he left? I now recognize Ms. Green from Georgia for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fauci, you were quoted on CBS Face the Nation saying it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci?
I am a scientist who uses the scientific method to gain information.
Yes, you said you represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci? Yes
Again,
or no? Yes or no?
No, that's not a yes or no
Yes,
answer.
it's a yes or no.
I don't think it is.
Okay, well, we'll take that as a you don't know what you represent.
Oh,
But this, as director of the NIH, you did sign off on these so-called scientific experiments. And as a dog lover, I want to tell you this is disgusting and evil, what you signed off on, and these experiments that happened to beagles paid for by the American taxpayer. And I want you to know Americans don't pay their taxes for animals to be tortured like this. So the type of science that you are representing, Mr. Fauci, is abhorrent, and it needs to stop. Mr. Fauci, you also represent the type of science that where you confess that you made up the COVID rules.
I didn't hear
including
what you
6
said.
feet social distancing and masking of children.
I never
You just-
said I made anything up.
You admitted that you made it up. You
I
made it
didn't
up as
say
you
I
went.
made it up.
So are you saying this is fake news, Mr.
I
Fauci?
didn't say I made anything up.
What did you say?
I said that it is not based in science and it just appeared.
But this is science.
What does dogs have to do with anything that we're talking about today?
These are scientific experiments. This is what you signed off on. But you also told the American people they had to distance by 6 feet. They had to wear masks. But let's also talk a little bit further about the type of science that you represent. NIH scientists made $710 million in royalties from drug makers, a fact that's been hidden. Let's talk about the fact about, is it right for scientists and doctors getting paid by the American people, government taxpayer paychecks, to get patents where they're paid millions and hundreds of millions of dollars in royalty fees, especially when the NIH and these government agencies, most powerful agencies in our country, are recommending medical suggestions and advice and making up guidelines like 6 feet distancing and masking of children. Do you think that's appropriate? Do the American people deserve to be abused like that, Mr. Fauci? Because you're not doctor. You're Mr. Fauci in my few minutes. No, I don't need your answer. I want to talk about this right here.
Mr. Chairman,
Fauci,
objection.
I reclaim my time.
Objection.
I reclaim my time. I reclaim my time, Mr. Raskin.
Gentlelady will suspend.
Mr. Chairman,
Point of order.
just in terms of the rules of decorum, are we allowed to deny that a doctor is a doctor just because we don't want him to be a doctor?
Yes, because in my time, that man does not deserve to have a license. As a matter of fact, it should be revoked, and he belongs in
Gentlelady will
prison.
suspend. The gentlelady should recognize the doctor as a doctor.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, is this what we have become? Is this what we have devolved into? No decorum.
You know what? We can do that hearing about the poor men that were injected with syphilis, because I support you in that. That's horrific. And this government that does things like that to Americans doesn't have decorum to the American people.
Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman is out of
point of regular order, please.
The gentleman is out of order.
Decorum.
Recognize the point of order. Go ahead with your point of order.
You got it.
No, I mean, I was going to say what Representative Raskin said. That's completely unacceptable to be able to deny Dr. Fauci, who's here, a respected member of the medical community, his title. And that's actually a personal attack on his character.
And I have instructed her.
He's not respected.
And I've instructed her to address him as a doctor.
I'm not
Gentlelady
addressing
shall
him as
continue.
doctor. Let's talk about
Mr. Chairman,
this.
I
I'm
would
reclaiming
move that
my
the woman's
time. I'm reclaiming my time.
Words get taken
I'm
down.
reclaiming my time.
Second that.
Point of order.
Suspend.
All right.
A member can only move to have words. I'm sorry. The issues we are debating are important ones that members feel deeply about. And while vigorous disagreement is part of the legislative process, as I said at the beginning, members are reminded that we must adhere to established standards of decorum in debate. This is a reminder that it is a violation of House rules and the rules of this committee to engage in personalities regarding other members or to question the motives of a colleague. Remarks of that type are not permitted by the rules and are not in keeping with the best traditions of our committee. The chair will enforce these rules of decorum at all times and urges all members to be mindful of their remarks. Does the gentleman from California have anything further?
We should take her words down.
Yeah, I made it. I offered that her words be taken down, Mr. Chairman.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a point of order.
Mr.
Because
Griffin
they
is
accused us
Mr.
of
Griffin is
worshiping
gentlelady
President Trump. We
gentlelady-
don't worship President Trump.
Gentlelady will suspend. Mr. Griffin, you have a point of order.
Mr. Chairman, while it may not be polite, I believe the rule only applies to members of this body, the Senate, and the President of the United States. I do not believe that it applies. The rule on taking down words does not apply to a witness. Again, I'm not condoning the words. I'm just relating or asking whether or not it applies to individuals who are just happen to be here in front of us.
I agree. The chair overrules the point of order. by the gentleman from Maryland, but ask that members please afford all other members the respect they're entitled, refrain from using rhetoric that could be construed as an attack on the motives or character of another member or the witness. You may proceed.
Thank you. This was a time in history where you got to throw out the first pitch at the Washington Nationals baseball game, while Americans were forced to stay home and watch such events that they love from at home alone on their televisions. And what a hypocrisy this picture shows. Here you are without your mask, with empty seats everywhere. Remember the cardboard cutout fans? That was one of the most insulting things to Americans, having to watch the games from home, where you got to go and enjoy the game and sit right next to people not following the 6 feet of distancing, not wearing your mask, and everyone else was forced to stay home and stop enjoying life. And your science here, your science is displayed perfectly in this picture, where children in school were put in plastic bubbles because of your science, your repulsive, evil science. And let's go back to your very own email. You said earlier you don't use email. Oh, you do. Right here. This is your own email where you said the typical mask you buy in the drugstore is not really effective in keeping out virus. I do not recommend that you wear a mask. This is your email. This is your own words. But yet children all over America were forced to wear masks. Healthy children forced to wear masks, muzzled in their schools. And then they were forced to learn from home because of your so-called science and your medical suggestions, while you and all your cronies get paid from Big Pharma. You know that what this committee should be doing? We should be recommending you to be prosecuted. We should be writing a criminal referral because you should be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. You belong in prison, Dr. Fauci.
Mr. Chairman, I have another point of order.
I recognize Ms. Dingell.
Just want to make sure the record is clear. Dr. Fauci testified that he did not use his personal email for official business. He did not say he did not use email. And I think today, this particular has been full of lies and disregard and disrespect, and we need to stick to facts.